If someone had told me a year ago that the loudest, most disruptive force in my life would become its quiet center, I would have prescribed them a long rest and a strong dose of reality. My life, before him, was a carefully curated museum of solitude. Each object in its place. Each day a perfect replica of the one before. I worked from home, a restorer of rare books, a surgeon for paper and ink. My apartment was my sanctuary, my operating theater, my fortress. The silence within it was a precious, living thing, something I cultivated like a delicate orchid. It was a silence built of the soft rasp of parchment under my fingers, the gentle click of a closing book, the sigh of my own breathing. Then, Marcus moved in across the hall. He was not silent. Marcus was a demolition. He was the thunder of work boots on the communal hallway floor at 6 in the morning. He was the bass line of some aggressive, thumping music that vibrated through my floorboards in the evening. He was the loud, booming laughter that echoed from his open doorway when friends came over, a sound so full of life it felt like a personal attack on my peace. I watched him through my peephole, a tiny, distorted lens that made him seem like a creature from another world. He was big. Not just tall, but broad, a landscape of a man built from solid muscle and confident strides. He carried his own groceries, 6 bags at a time, his biceps straining against the fabric of his t-shirt. He had a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow that seemed more like a geological feature than a matter of grooming. He was, in a word, intimidating. He was everything my life was not. Loud. Uncontained. Viscerally, overwhelmingly present. Our interactions were minimal, a currency of curt nods exchanged in the hallway. I would be returning with my single bag of groceries, mostly tea and vegetables. He would be leaving, smelling of sawdust and sweat, his presence taking up all the air in the narrow corridor. His eyes, a sharp, clear blue, would flick over to me. Not with malice, not even with interest. Just a brief, dismissive acknowledgement. And I would hurry inside, my heart doing a strange, frantic flutter against my ribs, a bird startled from its nest. I told myself it was annoyance. I told myself it was the righteous indignation of a quiet man whose quiet world had been invaded. But my observations through the peephole became a ritual. A secret study. I learned the rhythm of his days. The departure in the dark of morning, the return in the dusty light of evening. I saw the women who sometimes left his apartment in the morning, their laughter a little too bright, their steps a little too quick. Each one was a small, sharp sting in a place I refused to name. He was a planet, and I was a distant, unnoticed moon, caught in his orbit, cataloging his weather patterns from a safe distance. This was the status quo. The barrier between us was the 30 feet of worn carpeting in the hallway, but it might as well have been a universe. He was the noise, I was the silence. And that was how it was meant to be. Until the fire. The alarm was a shriek in the dead of night, a violent, metallic scream that ripped me from a dream of crumbling papyrus. Confusion first. Then the smell. Acrid smoke, thick and oily, slithering under my door. Panic, cold and absolute, seized my lungs. My carefully ordered world dissolved into a chaos of sirens and shouting. I grabbed my wallet, my keys, and threw on a coat over my pajamas, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the deadbolt. The hallway was a murky, surreal tunnel filled with panicked neighbors. And then I saw him. Marcus. He was not panicking. He was moving with a purpose that seemed impossible in the chaos, his large frame a point of stability in the swirling smoke. He was knocking on doors, his voice a low, commanding rumble. Everybody out. Now. Use the stairs. His eyes found mine through the haze. For the first time, they held on me for more than a fraction of a second. There was no recognition, just an assessment. You okay? Go, he yelled, pointing toward the stairwell. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and joined the stream of bodies flowing down into the cold night air. We stood on the pavement, a huddled, disheveled flock, watching the flashing lights paint the face of our building in frantic strokes of red and white. The fire was small, contained to the laundry room in the basement, but the smoke was another story. It had poured through the ventilation system, a black, greasy breath that had coated everything. Hours later, when they finally let us back in, the reality of it hit me. My apartment, my sanctuary, was violated. The air was thick with a chemical stench, and a fine layer of soot covered every surface. My books. The thought was a physical blow. The building manager, a harried man with a clipboard, delivered the final verdict. My unit, and a few others on my side of the hall, were uninhabitable. Industrial cleaning, repainting. A week, at least, he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. My mind went blank. A week. I had no family in the city. My friends were scattered, living in tiny apartments themselves. A hotel felt like a sterile, impersonal hell. My carefully constructed world had been burned down, not by flames, but by their aftermath. I was standing in the hallway, staring at my soot-stained door, feeling the foundation of my life crumble into dust, when a voice cut through my internal spiral. "Hey." I turned. It was Marcus. His apartment, on the other side of the hall, had been largely unaffected. He was leaning against his doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. He looked tired. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep weariness in his eyes. "You got a place to go?" he asked. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its usual booming confidence. I shook my head, the movement feeling heavy and slow. "No. I'll find a hotel." The words tasted like ash. He was quiet for a long moment, just looking at me. His gaze was unnervingly direct, no longer dismissive. He was actually seeing me. Julian. The quiet guy from 4B. The guy with the pajamas under his coat. "That's stupid," he said, and for a second, my defenses flared. But then he continued. "Hotels are expensive. And soulless." He pushed off the doorframe. "I've got a spare room. It's mostly full of junk, but it has a bed. You can use it." The offer hung in the air between us, so unexpected it felt like a trick of the light. My mind screamed 1,000 refusals. "No, impossible, I can't, he's a stranger, he's the noise, he's the disruption." But my mouth, betraying all logic, said, "Okay." And just like that, the universe, with its cruel sense of humor, had forced me into the heart of the storm I had spent a year trying to avoid. Living with Marcus was like living inside a drum. Everything was amplified. The sound of his heavy tread on the hardwood floors, the slam of the refrigerator door, the low murmur of his voice on the phone. His presence was a physical entity that filled every corner of the apartment, leaving little room for my own quiet anxieties to breathe. The first day was a blur of awkwardness. I stayed in the spare room, a small, cluttered space that smelled of sawdust and old canvases. I tried to make myself small, invisible. A ghost in his machine. But he wouldn't allow it. "You hungry?" he'd call from the kitchen, not waiting for an answer before placing a plate of scrambled eggs on the small dining table. I ate, because refusing seemed like a greater, more complicated effort than accepting. And in these forced moments of proximity, I started to see him. Really see him. I saw him without the distortion of the peephole. I noticed the fine web of lines around his eyes, etched there by sun and laughter. I saw the small, faded scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a tiny flaw in his otherwise perfect, rugged symmetry. I saw the way his shoulders, which always seemed so tense and squared in the hallway, would slump with exhaustion when he came home from work and dropped his tool belt by the door. He wasn't just a collection of loud noises and intimidating postures. He was a man. A tired man. One evening, I found him sitting on his couch, staring at nothing, a half-empty bottle of beer sweating onto the coaster beside him. His dog, an old, gray-muzzled retriever named Buster, had his head in Marcus's lap. Marcus was stroking the dog's ears, his large, calloused hands moving with a gentleness that seemed utterly at odds with the man I thought he was. He didn't notice me at first. His face, in the soft lamplight, was unguarded. All the confidence, the arrogance I had projected onto him, was gone. In its place was a profound loneliness. It was a look I recognized. I saw it in my own reflection sometimes, in the quiet of my apartment, before I learned to look away. He finally saw me hovering in the doorway. He didn't startle. He just sighed, a long, weary sound. "Long day," he said, a simple statement that felt like a confession. "Yes," I agreed, my voice barely a whisper. I took a hesitant step into the room, and the careful boundary I had maintained between us began to dissolve. The thaw, when it began, was not a gentle melt. It was a series of small, seismic shocks. The first touch happened in the kitchen. It was a tiny, inconsequential thing. He was making coffee, a morning ritual he performed with a surprising, almost meditative focus. I was trying to stay out of his way, get a glass for water, and retreat back to my room. The glasses were on a high shelf. I reached up, my fingers stretching for the cool, smooth surface. At the exact same moment, he turned from the counter, reaching for a mug on the same shelf. The back of his hand brushed against mine. It was nothing. A flicker of contact. But it was everything. His skin was warm and rough with calluses. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm, straight to my chest, where my heart kicked like a mule. Heat flooded my face. I snatched my hand back as if I'd touched a live wire. "Sorry," he grunted, pulling a mug from the shelf, his movements uninterrupted. He hadn't felt it. Or if he had, it meant nothing to him. But for me, the air in the kitchen had changed. It was charged, thick with unspoken things. I grabbed a glass, my hand trembling, and fled without the water. For the rest of the day, I was acutely aware of him, of the physical space he occupied. If he walked past my open door, the air stirred, carrying his scent, coffee and soap and something uniquely him, something like cedar wood. My body felt like a finely tuned instrument, and he was a magnetic force that set every string humming. It was terrifying. And it was exhilarating. The power dynamic between us shifted on the third night. A neighbor down the hall was having a barbecue on their balcony. The smell of charcoal and burning meat drifted through the open window. At first, it was just a smell. And then, it wasn't. It was the smell of the fire. The thick, greasy smoke. The memory didn't creep in, it slammed into me. The hallway, the alarms, the feeling of choking. My breath hitched. My chest tightened, a band of iron squeezing the air from my lungs. The room started to tilt, the walls closing in. I stumbled back, landing heavily on the bed in my temporary room, my hands clutching at my throat. My heart was a frantic trapped bird, beating its wings against the cage of my ribs. I am not safe. The thought was a primal scream in my head. I am not safe. I didn't hear him come in. I just felt a large, warm presence beside me. Julian. His voice was low, cutting through the roaring in my ears. I couldn't answer. I could only gasp, my eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the phantom smoke filling my lungs. I expected him to be annoyed. I expected him to be dismissive, to tell me to get a grip. He was not. He knelt in front of me, bringing his face level with mine. His bright blue eyes were steady, calm. "Hey. Look at me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You're okay. You're here. You're safe." He didn't touch me. He just held my gaze. "Breathe with me," he commanded softly. In, he took a slow, deliberate breath. And out. I tried to follow, my own breath a ragged, desperate sob. "Again," he said. In. Out. "That's it. You're doing good." Slowly, painstakingly, he guided me back from the edge. The iron band around my chest loosened its grip. The roaring in my ears subsided. The room solidified around me. When I could finally breathe again, a wave of shame washed over me, hot and sickening. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Don't be," he said, still kneeling. "It was the barbecue, wasn't it? The smell." I nodded, unable to look at him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I hate the sound of power saws." The statement was so random, Southwest out of place, that I lifted my head and stared at him. "My dad," he explained, his gaze distant. "He was a carpenter, too. Drank a lot. When he was in a mood, he'd go out to the workshop and just cut wood. 4 hours. The sound of the saw. It meant you just had to stay away. Be quiet. Be invisible." He looked back at me, his eyes holding a vulnerability I never would have thought possible. "We've all got our things, Julian," he said softly. In that moment, he wasn't the intimidating giant from across the hall. He was just Marcus. A man with his own ghosts. He had seen me at my most broken, my most helpless, and he had not run away. He had knelt down, met me in the dark, and shown me a piece of his own. The playing field was level. The distance between us had vanished, burned away by a phantom fire and an old memory. The storm broke on a Friday night. It rolled in from the west, a bruised purple mass of clouds that swallowed the city skyline. The rain came first, a gentle tapping that quickly escalated into a torrential downpour. Then the thunder, a low, guttural growl that shook the window panes. And then, with a flicker and a final, apologetic hum, the power went out. We were plunged into a sudden, profound darkness. The only light was the intermittent, violent flash of lightning that illuminated the room in stark, ghostly tableaus. "Well, damn," Marcus's voice came from the direction of the living room. I heard him fumbling around, the scrape of a drawer opening. A moment later, a match flared, and the soft, warm glow of a candle flame pushed back the darkness. He lit a few more, placing them around the room, their flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The apartment was transformed. It was no longer just his space. It became a cave, a shelter, an intimate, isolated world for two. The usual distractions were gone. No television droning in the corner. No phones to scroll through. There was only the sound of the rain lashing against the windows and the silence between us, a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a palpable tension. We sat on the couch, a careful foot of space between us, watching the storm. "I used to love storms," I said, my voice sounding strange in the quiet. "When I was a kid. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I used to hide under the bed," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. "Buster still does." We fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. A comfortable one. The carefully constructed walls I had built around myself were eroding, washed away by the rain and the candlelight and his unexpected honesty. "You know," he said, turning his head to look at me, his face half in shadow, "I used to think you hated me." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. "What? No. Why would you think that?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Come on, Julian. The way you'd look at me in the hall. Like I was something you scraped off your shoe. You'd practically run into your apartment to get away from me." My stomach twisted. He had seen it all. My fear. My stupid, irrational intimidation. And he had interpreted it as hate. "It wasn't hate," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "God, no. It was. I was intimidated by you." "Intimidated?" He sounded genuinely surprised. "By me? I'm just a guy who builds things." "You're a lot," I struggled to explain. "You're so present. You take up space. And your life is so full of sound." I looked down at my hands, twisting in my lap. "My life is quiet. By design. And you were this loud, confident, disruptive force." It was overwhelming. I risked a glance at him. He was watching me, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "It wasn't hate, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "It was the opposite of hate." A flash of lightning illuminated his face, and in that split second, I saw something shift in his eyes. Understanding. And something else. Something that mirrored the frantic fluttering in my own chest. The space between us on the couch suddenly felt charged, impossibly small. The air was thick with unspoken confessions, with a year's worth of stolen glances through a peephole and misunderstood nods in a hallway. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just kept watching me, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if anything was going to happen, I would have to be the one to bridge that final, terrifying gap. My heart was a war drum in my ears. My entire life had been a series of retreats, of building walls, of choosing the safety of solitude over the risk of connection. But looking at him now, in the warm, secret world of the candlelit room, the risk felt less important than the possibility. I leaned in. It was the bravest, most reckless thing I had ever done. I watched his eyes widen slightly, his breath catch in his throat. I gave him every opportunity to pull away, to laugh, to tell me I had misread everything. He didn't. He met me halfway. His lips were softer than I could have ever imagined. The kiss was not frantic or passionate. It was a question. It was hesitant, searching, a slow, quiet discovery in the dark. There was the faint taste of beer and something else, something uniquely Marcus. I felt his rough, calloused hand come up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking gently against my skin. The touch was grounding, a solid anchor in the swirling storm of emotion inside me. And I kissed him back. I poured every bit of my year of silent observation, my fear, my longing, my loneliness into that single, fragile point of contact. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. The sound of the rain seemed very far away. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. "Julian," he breathed, and my name on his lips was a revelation. It was not a question anymore. It was an answer. I woke up to the clinical gray light of morning. The storm had passed. The power was back on, the digital clock on the oven blinking a relentless, accusatory 12 o'clock. And I was alone. The other side of the couch, where we had eventually fallen asleep, was empty. A blanket was pulled on the floor. The candles were extinguished, leaving behind small, sad puddles of wax. The intimacy of the night before had evaporated with the darkness, leaving behind the harsh, unforgiving light of day. Anxiety, a familiar, cold serpent, began to uncoil in my stomach. I sat up, my body stiff, my mind racing. A mistake. It was a mistake. A trick of the light, an emotional fluke brought on by a thunderstorm and too much honesty. I heard a noise from the bedroom and my heart leaped with a desperate, foolish hope. Marcus emerged, already dressed for work in jeans and a dusty t-shirt. He was pulling on his boots, his movements brisk, efficient. He avoided my eyes. "Morning," he said, his voice clipped, devoid of the warmth from the night before. He was a stranger again. The wall was back up, higher and more impenetrable than ever. "Good morning," I managed, my voice small. He grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. His phone rang, and he answered it, turning away from me. "Yeah, on my way," he grunted into the phone. "An hour, maybe. The highway's a mess after the storm." He hung up and shoved the phone in his pocket. He finally looked at me, a quick, almost pained glance. "Got to go," he said. "Emergency job." A tree came down on a deck. And that was it. No mention of the kiss. No acknowledgement of the tectonic shift that had occurred between us. Just work boots and an emergency job and a hasty retreat. He was out the door before I could form a single word, the slam of it echoing in the silent apartment. I was left alone with the blinking clock and the sour taste of regret. The silence he left behind was a tangible thing, a physical weight pressing down on me. It was 100 times worse than the comfortable solitude of my own apartment. This was a silence defined by an absence. A silence that screamed with everything that had been left unsaid. My self-recrimination was a vicious, relentless cycle. I had pushed too far. I had misread everything. I had taken a moment of kindness, of shared vulnerability, and I had ruined it by wanting more. I was the quiet, strange neighbor who had developed a pathetic crush and forced an awkward, unwanted intimacy on his kind, unsuspecting host. The shame was so thick I felt like I was choking on it. The building manager called later that day. My apartment was ready. The painters had finished. The air was clear. I packed my small bag of belongings with a mechanical, numb efficiency. I wrote a note for Marcus. My hand shook as I wrote the simple, cowardly words. "Thanks for everything. The apartment's ready, so I'm heading back. Julian." I left it on the kitchen counter, next to the sad, waxy remains of the candles. I let myself out of his apartment, the click of the lock sounding like a final, definitive end. Walking back into my own apartment felt like entering a tomb. It was clean, sterile, smelling faintly of fresh paint. Everything was in its place. The silence was absolute. But it was no longer a comfort. It was a punishment. I stood in the middle of my living room, surrounded by my books, my carefully ordered life, and I had never felt more alone. The first 24 hours were a special kind of hell. Every creak in the hallway, every footstep, sent a jolt of pathetic hope through me. Maybe that was him. Maybe he was coming to knock on my door. But the knock never came. I heard him come home from work. I heard the familiar, heavy tread of his boots. I heard his door open and close. And then, nothing. The silence from across the hall was a deafening roar. He had my note. He knew I was back. And he was choosing to stay away. The confirmation of my fears was a cold, hard stone in my gut. Another day passed. And another. I tried to work, but the ancient texts blurred before my eyes. The quiet precision required for my job was impossible when my mind was a screaming chaos of what-ifs and if-onlys. I had tasted connection, real, tangible connection, for the first time in years. And now, the solitude I had once cherished felt like starvation. I was a ghost in my own life again, haunting the hallways of my apartment, my only company the bitter knowledge of what I had briefly held and immediately lost. On the third night, I gave up. I accepted it. It was over before it had even begun. We would go back to being strangers, but it would be worse now. Now, our nods in the hallway would be freighted with the memory of a candlelit kiss and a clumsy, panicked retreat. The thought was unbearable. I was sitting in my armchair, staring at a book I hadn't turned a page of in an hour, when the knock came. It was a soft, hesitant knock. Not the confident rap of a delivery person or a neighbor. My heart stopped. It couldn't be. I didn't move. Maybe if I stayed silent, it would go away. The knock came again, a little more insistent this time. Slowly, like an old man, I got to my feet. My legs felt unsteady. I walked to the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't look through the peephole. I was too afraid of what I would see, or what I wouldn't. I took a breath. And I opened the door. It was him. Marcus stood there, his large frame seeming to fill my entire doorway. He looked wrecked. His hair was a mess, like he'd been running his hands through it. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his jaw was tight with a tension that looked painful. He wasn't the confident giant from the hallway, or the gentleman from the power outage. He was someone new. Someone uncertain and frayed at the edges. We just stood there for a long moment, the silence of the hallway stretching between us. Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low and rough. I nodded, stepping back to let him pass. He walked into the center of my living room and stood there, looking lost. He seemed too big for the space, a force of nature contained within my quiet, ordered walls. I closed the door, the soft click sealing us inside together. "I'm an idiot," he said, not looking at me. He was staring at my bookshelf, at the neat rows of leather-bound spines. "I'm a coward," he continued, his voice tight. He finally turned to face me, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes stole the air from my lungs. "I'm so sorry, Julian." "What for?" I whispered, though I knew. "For that morning. For just running." I panicked. He took a step closer. "Nothing like that has ever happened to me before." "Not like that." "It wasn't casual. It felt," he struggled for the word, "important. And it scared the hell out of me." He gestured vaguely around my apartment. "My whole life is about being the strong one. The guy who fixes things. The guy who has it all together. It's an act. It's armor. And that night, with you, I felt like I didn't have any armor on. And when the sun came up, I didn't know how to be that person in the daylight." His confession was a key, turning a lock deep inside me. All my fear, all my self-recrimination, it all dissolved, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost knocked me off my feet. "I thought I had scared you," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "I thought I had misread everything and made you uncomfortable." "No," he said, shaking his head, a look of anguish on his face. "God, no. You didn't misread anything. You were just braver than I was." He took another step, closing the remaining distance between us. He was so close now I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "These last few days," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "living across the hall from you, knowing you were in here, and not being able to knock on this door. It's been the longest, quietest 3 days of my life." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before it gently cupped my cheek. His touch was warm, solid. Real. "I'm scared of this, Julian," he whispered, his thumb stroking my skin. "I don't know what I'm doing." "Me neither," I breathed, leaning into his touch. "I've spent my entire adult life avoiding this exact feeling." A small, wry smile touched his lips. "So we're just two cowards, figuring it out." "I suppose so," I said, a smile of my own finally breaking through. The tension that had been gripping me for days finally, blessedly, released its hold. We weren't broken. We were just new. And we were both terrified. And that was okay. He kept his hand on my cheek, his blue eyes searching mine. "I don't want to go back to just nodding in the hallway," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't either." He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of profound relief. Then his other hand reached into his pocket. He pulled out a single key on a simple silver ring. He pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. It was the key to his apartment. "Just in case," he said softly. "In case you need to escape the smell of paint. Or in case you just want to come over. So you don't have to knock." I stared at the key lying in my hand. It was heavy. Solid. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of forever. It was something quieter, and perhaps more meaningful. It was an offering of access. A tangible symbol that the door between us was no longer a barrier. It was an invitation. I closed my hand tightly around it, the metal cool against my skin. "Okay," I said. And for the first time, in my own apartment, surrounded by my own silence, I felt completely, utterly safe. The new beginning didn't start with a bang. It started with the quiet hum of a coffee maker in the morning. I let myself into his apartment the next day, using the key. The act felt both transgressive and perfectly natural. He was in the kitchen, shirtless, his back to me as he measured out coffee grounds. The muscles in his back moved under his skin, a beautiful, complex landscape. He heard my footsteps and turned, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Hey," he said, his voice soft with sleep. "Hey," I replied. There was no awkwardness. No anxiety. Just a simple, comfortable peace. He poured 2 mugs of coffee, and we sat at his small table, the morning light streaming through the window, and we talked. We talked about books and buildings, about quiet fears and loud families, about all the small, essential things that make a person who they are. Our lives began to merge, not in a chaotic collision, but in a slow, gentle braiding. Evenings were spent on his couch, or mine. I would read, the weight of his leg pressed against mine, a comforting, solid presence. He would sketch designs for a new project, his brow furrowed in concentration, Buster snoring softly at our feet. We learned the rhythm of each other's silences. Mine was contemplative, a space for thought. His was one of weary peace, a shedding of the day's armor. We found a new kind of quiet together, one that wasn't about the absence of noise, but the presence of another person you didn't need to fill the space with words for. Sleeping in the same bed was a revelation. The first night, I was a bundle of nerves, hyper-aware of his every breath, his every shift in weight. But he just pulled me against his chest, his arm wrapping around me, and held me. He smelled of soap and sleep. His body was a furnace of warmth against my back. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel like a solitary island in the dark. I felt anchored. I fell asleep faster and deeper than I had in years, secure in the simple, profound knowledge that I was not alone. My carefully curated museum of solitude was gone. In its place was a life, messy and unpredictable and infinitely richer. My fortress had been breached, not by an enemy, but by a man who saw the lonely king inside and didn't run away. He simply offered him a key to a warmer room. Sometimes I think about the fire. That violent, chaotic disruption that I thought was the worst thing that could have happened. It was a disaster that razed my ordered world to the ground. But it was also the catalyst. It was the emergency that forced 2 planets, stuck in their separate, lonely orbits, to finally collide. Marcus wasn't a disruption to my peace. He was the beginning of a new kind of peace, one I never knew I was starving for. A peace that is not built on silence and solitude, but on the steady, comforting presence of another heartbeat in the dark. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the loud, beautiful, unexpected answer to a question I was too afraid to even ask myself. Have you ever had a moment in your life that felt like a disaster at the time, but ended up being the best thing that ever happened to you? Let me know your own stories of unexpected blessings in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing for more tales of love found in the most unlikely of places.